They weren't who you think they were. The men Hollywood sold as the ultimate dream lovers were hiding lives that could have destroyed them overnight. So why did studios go to extreme lengths to protect their image? And what were they so afraid of the public discovering? Behind the romance, the charm, and the flawless smiles was a system built on silence. And once you see how deep it goes, you'll never look at these icons the same way again. Rock Hudson. At the height of 1950s Hollywood, no man defined the ideal romantic lead more convincingly than Rock Hudson. He wasn't just a star, he was a carefully engineered fantasy. Women adored him, studios depended on him, and every smile he gave on screen reinforced the illusion of effortless masculinity. But behind that polished image was a reality that had to be buried at all costs. Hudson's private life was tightly controlled by powerful figures like Henry Wilson, who understood that the truth could shatter everything overnight. Even his marriage wasn't what it appeared to be. It was a calculated move to silence growing rumors. Within Hollywood, many already knew. Outside of it, the illusion held strong. That contrast between what audiences saw and what was hidden captures the essence of an era built on deception. Hudson didn't just play a role on screen, he lived one off it every single day, knowing that one misstep could end his career instantly. Tab Hunter. Tab Hunter was the Golden Boy Studios dreamed of creating. Blonde, charming, and effortlessly likable, he became the face of youthful romance in the 1950s. Teenage fans flooded theaters to see him, convinced he was the embodiment of the perfect boyfriend. But that image came with a strict condition. It had to remain unquestioned. Behind the scenes, Hunter was living a life that could never be acknowledged publicly. Studio executives monitored his movements, controlled his publicity, and suppressed anything that hinted at the truth. Even minor rumors were treated like ticking bombs. What made Hunter's story different, however, is that he eventually told it himself. Years later, he would confirm what had long been hidden, exposing how deeply the system interfered with personal identity. During his peak, though, silence was survival. Every interview, every appearance, every carefully staged romance was part of a larger performance. The audience saw authenticity, but it was all constructed, and the pressure of maintaining that illusion never truly went away. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift didn't fit the traditional mold of a Hollywood leading man, and that's exactly what made him unforgettable. Sensitive, intense, and emotionally raw, he brought a depth to his performances that audiences hadn't seen before. But off-screen, his life was just as complex. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Clift didn't fully conform to the rigid expectations placed on male stars. Within Hollywood circles, his relationships with both men and women were known, but never discussed publicly. It was an unspoken agreement, acknowledged privately, denied publicly. Clift existed in a fragile space between acceptance and risk, where authenticity had to be carefully measured. The studios couldn't fully control him, but they could control the narrative surrounding him. And so his image remained ambiguous, never confirmed, never denied. Where that ambiguity became its own kind of shield. Yet it also reflected the limitations of the era, where even someone as respected as Clift couldn't live entirely openly. His story isn't just about secrecy, it's about navigating a system that demanded silence, even from those who redefined the very idea of masculinity. William Haynes. William Haynes was one of the biggest stars of the late silent era, known for his charm, confidence, and undeniable screen presence. He had everything Hollywood valued until he refused to follow its most important rule. At a time when studios controlled every aspect of an actor's life, Haynes was given a clear ultimatum: marry a woman and maintain the illusion, or lose everything. Unlike others, he didn't hesitate. He chose his partner, Jimmy Shields, over his career. In doing so, once he walked away from fame at its peak, it was a decision almost unheard of in that era, a quiet act of defiance in an industry built on conformity. Hollywood didn't forgive easily, opportunities disappeared, and his acting career ended almost overnight. But what followed was something even more remarkable. Haynes reinvented himself as a successful interior designer, building a new life entirely outside the system that had rejected him. His story stands apart because it wasn't about hiding, it was about refusal. In a time defined by secrecy, Haynes chose truth, no matter the cost. Dirk Bogard. Dirk Bogard began his career as the quintessential British heartthrob, handsome, composed, and perfectly suited for romantic roles. Audiences saw elegance and control, but behind that image was a life carefully shielded from public scrutiny. And during the height of his fame, homosexuality was not just scandalous, it was illegal in Britain. The risks weren't just professional, they were deeply personal. Bogard lived for decades with his partner, yet publicly, the relationship was never defined. Within the industry, the truth was understood. Outside of it, silence remained essential. What makes Bogard's story particularly compelling is how he subtly challenged the system from within. As his career evolved, he began choosing roles that hinted at deeper, more complex identities, performances that carried an undercurrent of truth without ever stating it outright. It was a quiet form of resistance, expressed through art rather than declaration. The closet, as it's often described, wasn't completely sealed. It was carefully managed, slightly open to those who knew where to look. A Bogard didn't just survive the system, he navigated it with precision, revealing just enough to leave a lasting impression without risking total exposure. Anthony Perkins. Before he became forever associated with Psycho, Anthony Perkins was positioned as one of Hollywood's most promising young romantic leads. He had the looks, the charm, and the quiet intensity that studios believed could carry him into long-term stardom. But beneath that carefully cultivated image was a private life that didn't align with the expectations placed on him. Perkins was part of a hidden network within Hollywood, an unspoken world where actors navigated relationships in secrecy, bound by fear of exposure. His relationship with Tab Hunter was one of many connections that existed behind closed doors, far from public view. What made Perkins' situation even more complex was the psychological toll of maintaining that divide. The roles he played began to blur with the pressures he carried off screen. As his career shifted after Psycho, the industry's perception of him changed, and the opportunities he once had began to narrow. His story reflects not just secrecy, but the long-term consequences of living under constant scrutiny, where identity itself became something to manage rather than express. Ramon Novarro. Ramon Novarro was one of the silent era's most captivating stars, often positioned as a rival to Rudolph Valentino. With striking features and a commanding presence, he became the embodiment of exotic romance for audiences around the world. But his life off-screen was marked by an internal conflict that never truly resolved. A devout Catholic, Novarro struggled deeply with his sexuality, caught between personal truth and religious belief. In Hollywood, his private life was handled with extreme discretion, known to some, but never acknowledged publicly. The illusion remained intact, even as the pressures behind it intensified. Unlike later generations, Novarro didn't have the option of openness. Everything had to be contained, controlled, and hidden. His story took a tragic turn in 1968 when his life ended under violent circumstances, bringing renewed attention to the secrets he had spent decades protecting. In many ways, Novarro represents the emotional cost of that era's silence. He wasn't just maintaining an image. He was navigating a constant internal battle, one that the public never saw. And by the time the truth became more widely understood, it was far too late for him to tell it on his own terms. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando didn't just challenge Hollywood's idea of masculinity, he redefined it entirely. Raw, unpredictable, and intensely magnetic, he brought a new kind of realism to the screen that felt almost dangerous. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Brando didn't fully submit to the industry's expectations, either on screen or off. While others were forced into silence, Brando later spoke openly about his experiences, acknowledging that he had relationships with both men and women. It was a rare admission, especially from someone of his stature. But during the height of his career, even Brando operated within a system that preferred ambiguity over truth. His image as a rebellious outsider worked in his favor. It created a space where contradictions could exist without immediate scrutiny. Still, there were limits to how far that freedom could go. Hollywood thrived on control, and even someone as influential as Brando wasn't entirely beyond its reach. What makes his story stand out is the contrast between power and restriction. He had more freedom than most, yet still couldn't exist entirely outside the system. His admissions came later, when the risks were no longer the same. And in doing so, he revealed just how much had been left unsaid, not just by him, but by an entire generation of stars. Sal Mineo. Sal Mineo's rise to fame was explosive. After his breakout role in Rebel Without a Cause alongside James Dean, he became one of the most recognizable young faces in Hollywood. When audiences saw vulnerability, intensity, and emotional honesty, qualities that made him stand out in a sea of polished leading men. But that same authenticity made him difficult for the system to control. As Mineo grew older, the industry that once embraced him began to distance itself. His image no longer fit the narrow expectations of a safe leading man, and opportunities started to fade. Unlike many of his peers, Mineo eventually spoke openly about his bisexuality, becoming one of the few actors of his era to do so with relative honesty. It was a bold move, but it came at a cost. Hollywood wasn't ready to accept that kind of openness, and his career never fully recovered. His story highlights a shift from enforced silence to risky honesty, and the consequences that came with it. Mineo didn't just lose roles. He lost the protective illusion that had once sustained his fame. In revealing the truth, he stepped outside the boundaries that had defined his success, exposing just how fragile that success really was. Farley Granger. Farley Granger had the kind of career most actors would envy, working with directors like Alfred Hitchcock and starring in films such as Strangers on a Train. On screen, he often played charming, slightly mysterious young men caught in complicated situations. Off-screen, his life was just as layered, though far less visible. Granger moved within Hollywood's hidden social circles, where actors, writers, and directors lived double lives away from public scrutiny. What sets him apart is that he eventually chose to speak about it. In his memoir, Granger openly discussed his relationships with both men and women, offering a rare first-hand look into a world that had long been kept secret. During his peak years, however, that openness wasn't possible. Like many others, he navigated a delicate balance, maintaining a public image while quietly living a different reality. The system didn't just demand silence, it depended on it. Granger understood the rules, and for much of his career, he followed them. But by later revealing his story, he exposed the structure that had shaped it. His experience shows how deeply the illusion was embedded, not just in publicity, but in everyday life. And once that illusion was finally broken, it changed the way his entire career was understood. Cary Grant. Cary Grant wasn't just a movie star, he was the definition of sophistication. With effortless charm, sharp wit, and undeniable screen presence, he became the gold standard for the romantic leading man. Audiences believed in him completely, but behind that flawless image was a personal life that has never been fully explained. For years, Grant lived with fellow actor Randolph Scott, and their close domestic arrangement became one of Hollywood's most quietly discussed relationships. Photographs of them together, relaxed and comfortable, circulated at the time, yet the narrative presented to the public remained carefully controlled. Studios dismissed speculation, the press avoided direct questions, and the illusion stayed intact. Whether their bond was romantic or not has never been definitively confirmed, but the persistence of the rumors reveals something deeper about the era. Even the possibility of truth had to be contained. Grant himself never addressed the speculation publicly, maintaining the same composure off-screen that he displayed on it. That silence wasn't accidental. It was necessary. His entire career depended on maintaining a specific image, one that couldn't withstand uncertainty. What makes his story so compelling isn't what was proven, but what was never allowed to be clarified. In a system built on control, ambiguity became its own form of protection, and perhaps its most powerful illusion. Randolph Scott. Randolph Scott built his career on a very different kind of image. Where Cary Grant represented urban elegance, Scott embodied rugged masculinity, the strong, silent type who dominated Westerns throughout the 1940s and 50s. On screen, there was no ambiguity. He was decisive, confident, and unmistakably traditional in his portrayal of manhood. But off-screen, his life intersected with one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. His long-term living arrangement with Cary Grant placed him at the center of speculation that never quite disappeared. Unlike fleeting rumors, this was a sustained narrative. Years of shared homes, public appearances, and a bond that seemed deeper than typical friendship. Yet, like so many stories of that era, it remained officially unacknowledged. Scott himself never addressed the rumors, choosing instead to maintain his public persona without deviation. That consistency was crucial. In an industry that depended on clear, marketable identities, even a hint of uncertainty could be damaging. What makes Scott's case particularly striking is the contrast between his on-screen image and the questions surrounding his private life. It highlights the extent to which Hollywood relied on rigid definitions of masculinity and how carefully those definitions were protected. Whether the rumors were true or not, the silence surrounding them speaks volumes. In Golden Age Hollywood, perception wasn't just important, it was everything. James Dean. James Dean's career was brief, but his impact was immediate and lasting. He didn't just play misunderstood characters, he embodied them. With films like Rebel Without a Cause, Dean became the face of youthful rebellion, emotional conflict, and quiet defiance. Audiences connected with him in a way that felt almost personal, as if they were seeing something real rather than performed. But off-screen, that same complexity extended into his private life. Over the years, multiple biographers and insiders have suggested that Dean had relationships with both men and women, describing him as sexually fluid in a time that had no space for such nuance. Unlike others, Dean didn't live long enough to face the long-term consequences of that reality, or to confirm or deny it on his own terms. His sudden death froze his image in time, preserving the mystery as much as the legend. What remains is a carefully constructed narrative layered over unanswered questions. The studios protected his image while he was alive, and after his death, that image became untouchable. Dean represents something unique in this story, not just secrecy, but unfinished truth. His life was cut short before the system could fully define him, leaving behind a legacy that still invites speculation. And in that uncertainty, the line between who he was and who he was allowed to be remains forever blurred. Ivor Novello. Before Hollywood perfected the art of the manufactured heartthrob, figures like Ivor Novello were already living versions of that fantasy. A major star of the 1920s and 30s, Novello possessed a natural elegance that made him irresistible to audiences. He wasn't just admired, he was adored, both on stage and on screen. But unlike many who came after him, Novello existed in a slightly different world, one where discretion replaced denial. Within theatrical and artistic circles, his long-term relationship with Bobby Andrews was widely understood. It wasn't publicly declared, but it also wasn't aggressively hidden. This delicate balance allowed him to maintain both his career and his personal life, though always within unspoken limits. While the broader public, however, remained unaware, shielded by the same system of selective silence that would later define Hollywood. What makes Novello's story so important is its timing. He existed at the edge of two eras, one where private lives could exist quietly in plain sight, and another where studios would enforce stricter control over every detail. His experience shows that the illusion wasn't always absolute. Sometimes it was negotiated. But even then, truth had boundaries. Novello's life wasn't built on denial. It was built on careful positioning, where what was known depended entirely on who was looking. And that distinction would soon disappear entirely as the industry tightened its grip on image and identity. Noel Coward. Noel Coward didn't need to pretend to be charming. He defined what charm looked like. Witty, stylish, and endlessly charismatic, he became one of the most recognizable cultural figures of his time. His appeal wasn't built on rugged masculinity or traditional romance, but on intelligence, humor, and presence. And yet, even someone as distinctive as Coward wasn't free from the constraints of his era. His sexuality was widely understood within industry and social circles, but never openly stated. In Britain, where laws criminalized homosexuality, silence wasn't just strategic, it was essential. Coward mastered the art of implication. Through his work, his mannerisms, and his carefully crafted public persona, he communicated more than he ever explicitly said. Audiences saw sophistication. Those closer to him saw something deeper. This duality became his shield. Unlike actors who relied on romantic illusions, Noel Coward operated in a space where ambiguity worked in his favor. But that didn't mean he was truly free. Every public appearance, every interview, every performance existed within invisible boundaries. What makes his story so powerful is how seamlessly he navigated those limits. He didn't confront the system directly. He moved around it, shaping his identity in ways that couldn't be easily challenged. In doing so, he revealed something essential about the era. That survival didn't always depend on hiding completely. Sometimes it depended on being seen, just not fully understood. What these stars shared wasn't just fame. It was a carefully constructed silence that protected an entire system. Behind the romance and perfection was a world where identity had to be edited to survive. But time has a way of exposing what was hidden. And once those illusions begin to crack, the truth behind Hollywood's golden glow becomes impossible to unsee.